Once upon a time there was a young man called Lemuel Gulliver. He loved adventures and wanted to see the world. One day he set off across the sea on a big sailing ship. But soon, the weather got very bad. It was very stormy and the waves were huge. Suddenly, the ship started to sink. Gulliver jumped in the sea. He swam as hard as he could. Before long, he was washed up on a sandy beach. He was so tired and he fell fast asleep. When he woke up, he didn't know where he was. He couldn't move his hand. Then he tried to move his head and his legs. But he couldn't. He couldn't move at all. He wondered if he was dreaming. Then he felt something move on his leg. What was it? A little animal, like a mouse? Gulliver opened his eyes and there, standing on his chest, was a tiny person. Can you imagine how surprised he was? The tiny person looked cross. He had a tiny bow and arrow. Then, Gulliver saw there were lots more tiny people. They were climbing about on his arms and legs and chest. They all had bows and arrows. Gulliver was so surprised that he shouted very loudly. Then he heard lots of tiny cries. His shouts had made some of the little people fall to the ground. He looked down and saw that he was tied up with lots and lots of tiny ropes. He pulled his arm up and it came free. Then he did the same with his legs. Gulliver sat up. Then all the tiny people cried out. To them, Gulliver looked like a giant. Gulliver was really hungry. He smiled and pointed to his mouth. An important-looking tiny man in fine clothes walked up. He was the emperor of the tiny people. The emperor smiled at Gulliver. He told the tiny people to drop their bows and arrows. Then he spoke to some of them and pointed. Now they are going to get some food for me, thought Gulliver. I think I'm going to like it here. Soon, the tiny people brought lots and lots of tiny sandwiches, tiny salads and tiny vegetables and tiny cakes and sweets. After he had eaten all the lovely food, Gulliver felt much better. Then the tiny people made a place where Gulliver could sleep. Gulliver found out that the name of the island was Lilliput. The people were called Lilliputians. He showed the Lilliputians his watch. They couldn't believe the noise it made. He showed them some coins from his pocket. Each coin was the same size as one of the tiny people. The Lilliputians liked Gulliver very much and they kept bringing him lots of delicious tiny food. Gulliver was very happy. He liked the Lilliputians a lot. But he was ready for a new adventure. The emperor understood. You are a man who loves adventures, Gulliver, he said. But how can I leave? Gulliver asked. I'm too big for your little ships. And I can't swim all the way home. The emperor told all the Lilliputians, right, we are going to build the biggest boat ever built on Lilliput, he cried. The tiny people worked hard. They cut down their biggest trees and began to build a huge boat for their huge friend. Gulliver helped, too. He carried the heaviest pieces of wood and put them together to make the boat. The emperor gave Gulliver some tiny coins and a picture of Gulliver in Lilliput with his friends. Thank you, said Gulliver, for everything. Gulliver was sad to leave. His boat was wonderful, but it was still very small for him. I won't get all the way back home in this, he thought. Gulliver walked into the water. He pulled the boat behind him. Then he climbed on top and began the journey home. Gulliver sailed across the sea for days and days. Then he saw a huge ship. At last, he cried, I'm going home. The ship's crew heard him and they helped him to get onto their ship. He told the crew his story. The crew could hardly believe their ears. Tiny people, they said, never heard of such a thing. How can this be true? It is true, cried Gulliver, look. He showed them the tiny coins and the picture of him in Lilliput with his tiny friends. Maybe this story is true, they said. When Gulliver got home, he told his story to everyone. Some people believed him and a lot didn't. But Gulliver didn't mind as he knew what had really happened back on the island of Lilliput. It wasn't long before he set sail and went off on another amazing adventure. The end.